Under the Hill by Aubrey Beardsley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Amy Graymore, Holton, Maine. Chapter 1. The Abbé Fanfreluche, having lighted off his horse, stood doubtfully for a moment beneath the umber gateway of the mysterious hill, troubled with an exquisite fear lest a day's travel should have too cruelly undone the laboured niceness of his dress. His hand, slim and gracious as la Marquise de Defend in the drawing de Carmontel, played nervously about the gold hair that fell upon his shoulders like a finely curled peruke, and from point to point of a precise toilet the fingers wandered, quelling the little mutinies of cravat and ruffle. It was taper time, when the tired earth puts on its cloak of mists and shadows, when the enchanted woods are stirred with light footfalls and slender voices of the fairies, when all the air is full of delicate influences, and even the beaux, seated at their dressing tables, dream a little. A delicious moment, thought Fanfreluche, to slip into exile. The place where he stood waved drowsily with strange flowers, heavy with perfume, dripping with odours. Gloomy and nameless weeds not to be found in Mentzelius. Huge moths so richly winged they must have banqueted upon tapestries and royal stuffs, slept on the pillars that flanked either side of the gateway, and the eyes of all the moths remained open and were burning and bursting with a mesh of veins. The pillars were fashioned in some pale stone, and rose up like hymns in the praise of pleasure, for from cap to base each one was carved with loving sculptures, showing such a cunning invention and such a curious knowledge, that Fanfreluche lingered not a little in reviewing them. They surpassed all that Japan has ever pictured from her Maisons Vertes, all that was ever painted in the cool bathrooms of Cardinal Lamotte, and even outdid the astonishing illustrations to Jones's nursery numbers. "A pretty portal," murmured the Abbé, correcting his sash. As he spoke, a faint sound of singing was breathed out from the mountain, faint music as strange and distant as sea legends that are heard in shells. "The Vespers of Helen, I take it," said Fanfreluche, and struck a few chords of accompaniment, ever so lightly upon his lute. Softly across the spellbound threshold, the song floated and wreathed itself about the subtle columns, till the moths were touched with passion and moved quaintly in their sleep. One of them was awakened by the intenser notes of the Abbé's lute strings, and fluttered into the cave. Fanfreluche felt it was his cue for entry. "Adieu," he exclaimed with an inclusive gesture, and "Goodbye, Madonna," as the cold circle of the moon began to show beautiful and full of enchantments. There was a shadow of sentiment in his voice as he spoke the words. "Would to heaven," he sighed, "I might receive the assurance of a looking-glass before I make my debut. However, as she is a goddess, I doubt not her eyes are a little sated with perfection, and may not be displeased to see it crowned with a tiny fault." A wild rose had caught upon the trimmings of his ruff, and in the first flush of displeasure he would have struck it brusquely away, and most severely punished the offending flower. But the ruffled mood lasted only a moment, for there was something so deliciously incongruous in the hardy petal's invasion of so delicate a thing, that Fanfreluche withheld the finger of resentment, and vowed that the wild rose should stay where it had clung, a passport, as it were, from the upper to the underworld. "The very excess and violence of the fault," he said, "will be its excuse," and, undoing a tangle in the tassel of his stick, stepped into the shadowy corridor that ran into the bosom of the wan hill, stepped with the admirable aplomb and unwrinkled suavity of Don John. Chapter 2. Before a toilet that shone like the altar of Notre Dame de Victoires, Helen was seated in a little dressing gown of black and heliotrope. The coiffeur Cosme was caring for her scented chevelure, and with tiny silver tongs, warm from the caresses of the flame, made delicious intelligent curls that fell as lightly as a breath about her forehead and over her eyebrows, and clustered like tendrils round her neck. Her three favourite girls, Papillard, Blanchemonge, and Lorraine, waited immediately upon her with perfume and powder in delicate flagons and frail cassolettes, and held in porcelain jars the ravishing paints prepared by Chatelaine for those cheeks and lips that had grown a little pale with anguish of exile. Her 3 favorite boys, Claude, Claire, and Sarrasine, stood amorously about with salver, fan, and napkin. Millamant held a slight tray of slippers, Minette some tender gloves. La Popelinière, mistress of the robes, was ready with a frock of yellow and white. La Zambinella bore the jewels, Florizel some flowers, Amador a box of various pins, and Vadius a box of sweets. Her doves, ever in attendance, walked about the room that was panelled with the gallant paintings of Jean-Baptiste Duras, and some dwarfs and doubtful creatures sat here and there, lolling out their tongues, pinching each other, and behaving oddly enough. Sometimes Helen gave them little smiles. As the toilet was in progress, Mrs. Marsiple, the fat manicure and fardeuse, strode in and seated herself by the side of the dressing-table, greeting Helen with an intimate nod. She wore a gown of white watered silk with gold lace trimmings and a velvet necklet of false vermilion. Her hair hung in bandeaux over her ears, passing into a huge chignon at the back of her head, and the hat, wide-brimmed and hung with a valance of pink muslin, was floral with red roses. Mrs. Marsuple's voice was full of salacious unction. She had terrible little gestures with the hands, strange movements with the shoulders, a short respiration that made surprising wrinkles in her bodice, a corrupt skin, large horny eyes, a parrot's nose, a small loose mouth, great flaccid cheeks, and chin after chin. She was a wise person, and Helen loved her more than any other of her servants, and had 100 pet names for her, such as Dear Toad, Pretty Poll, Cock Robin, Dearest Lip, Touchstone, Little Cough Drop, Bijou, Buttons, Dear Heart, Dick Dock, Mrs. Manley, Little Nipper, Cacondelet, Naughty Naughty, Blessed Thing, and Trump. The talk that passed between Mrs. Marsiple and her mistress was of that excellent kind that passes between old friends, a perfect understanding giving to scraps of phrases their full meaning, and to the merest reference a point. Naturally, friend Felucci, the newcomer, was discussed a little. Helen had not seen him yet, and asked a score of questions on his account that were delightfully to the point. The report and the quaffing were completed at the same moment. "Cosme," said Helen, "you have been quite sweet and quite brilliant. You have surpassed yourself tonight." "Madame flatters me," replied the antique old thing, with a girlish giggle under his black satin mask. "Gad, madam, sometimes I believe I have no talent in the world, but tonight I must confess to a touch of the vain mood." It would pain me horribly to tell you about the painting of her face. Suffice it that the sorrowful work was accomplished, frankly, magnificently, and without a shadow of deception. Helen slipped away the dressing-gown, and rose before the mirror in a flutter of frilled things. She was adorably tall and slender. Her neck and shoulders were wonderfully drawn, and the little malicious breasts were full of the irritation of loveliness that can never be entirely comprehended, or ever enjoyed to the utmost. Her arms and hands were loosely but delicately articulated, and her legs were divinely long. From the hip to the knee, 22 inches. From the knee to the heel, 22 inches, as befitted a goddess. Those who have seen Helen only in the Vatican, in the Louvre, in the Uffizi, or in the British Museum, can have no idea how very beautiful and sweet she looked, not at all like the lady in Lempriere. Mrs. Marsiple grew quite lyric over the dear little person, and pecked at her arms with kisses. "Dear tongue, you must really behave yourself," said Helen, and called Millamant to bring her the slippers. The tray was freighted with the most exquisite and shapely pantofles, sufficient to make Cluny a place of naught. There were shoes of grey and black and brown suede, of white silk and rose satin, and velvet and sarcenet. There were some of sea green sewn with cherry blossoms, some of red with willow branches, and some of grey with bright winged birds. There were heels of silver, of ivory, and of gilt. There were buckles of very precious stones set in most strange and esoteric devices. There were ribbons tied and twisted into cunning forms. There were buttons so beautiful that the buttonholes might have no pleasure till they closed upon them. There were soles of delicate leathers scented with Maréchal, and linings of soft stuffs scented with the juice of July flowers. But Helen, finding none of them to her mind, called for a discarded pair of blood-red American, diapered with pearls. These looked very distinguished over her white silk stockings. Meantime, La Popelinere stepped forward with the frock. "I shan't wear one tonight," said Helen. Then she slipped on her gloves. When the toilet was at an end, all her doves clustered round her feet, loving to frolic her ankles with their plumes, and the dwarfs clapped their hands and put their fingers between their lips and whistled. Never before had Helen been so radiant and compelling. Spiridion, in the corner, looked up from his game of spellikins and trembled. Just then Prince Mungle announced that supper was ready upon the 5th terrace. "Ah," cried Helen, "I'm famished." Chapter 3. She was quite delighted with Fanfreluche, and of course he sat next to her at supper. The terrace, made beautiful with 1,000 vain and fantastical things, and set with 100 tables and 400 couches, presented a truly splendid appearance. In the middle was a huge bronze fountain with 3 basins. From the first rose a many-breasted dragon, and 4 little loves mounted upon swans, and each love was furnished with a bow and arrow. 2 of them that faced the monster seemed to recoil in fear. 2 that were behind made bold enough to aim their shafts at him. From the verge of the second sprang a circle of slim golden columns that supported silver doves with tails and wings spread out. The third, held by a group of grotesquely attenuated satyrs, was centered with a thin pipe hung with masks and roses and capped with children's heads. From the mouths of the dragon and the loves, from the swan's eyes, from the breasts of the doves, from the satyr's horns and lips, from the masks at many points, and from the children's curls, the water played profusely, cutting strange arabesques and subtle figures. The terrace was lit entirely by candles. There were 4,000 of them, not numbering those upon the tables. The candlesticks were of a countless variety, and smiled with moulded coconeries. Some were 20 feet high, and bore single candles that flared like fragrant torches over the feast, and guttered till the wax stood round the tops in tall lances. Some hung with dainty petticoats of shining lustres, had a whole bevy of tapers upon them, devised in circles, in pyramids, in squares, in cuneiforms, in single lines regimentally, and in crescents. Then on quaint pedestals, and terminal gods, and gracious pilasters of any sort, were shell-like vases of excessive fruits and flowers that hung about and burst over the edges and could never be restrained. The orange trees and myrtles, looped with vermilion sashes, stood in frail porcelain pots, and the rose trees were wound and twisted with superb invention over trellis and standard. Upon one side of the terrace a long gilded stage for the comedians was curtained off with Pagonian tapestries, and in front of its music stands were placed. The tables arranged between the fountain and the flight of steps to the 6th terrace were all circular, covered with white damask, and strewn with irises, roses, kingcups, columbines, daffodils, carnations, and lilies, and the couches, high with soft cushions and spread with more stuffs than could be named, had fans thrown upon them. Beyond the escalier stretched the gardens, which were designed so elaborately and with so much splendour that the architect of the Fête d'Armagnac could have found in them no matter for cavil. And the still lake strewn with profuse barges full of gay flowers and wax marionettes, the alleys of tall trees, the arcades and cascades, the pavilions, the grottos, and the garden gods, all took a strange tinge of revelry from the glare of the light that fell upon them from the feast. The frockless Helen and Fanfreluche, with Miss Marsupple, and Claude and Claire and Farcy, the chief comedian, sat at the same table. Fanfreluche, who had doffed his travelling suit, wore long black silk stockings, a pair of pretty garters, a very elegant ruffled shirt, slippers, and a wonderful dressing gown, and Farcy was in ordinary evening clothes. As for the rest of the company, it boasted some very noticeable dresses, and whole tables of quite delightful coiffures. There were spotted veils that seemed to stain the skin, fans with eye slits in them, through which the bearers peeped and peered, fans painted with figures and covered with the sonnets of Sporian and the short stories of Scaramouche, and fans of big living moths stuck upon mounts of silver sticks. There were masks of green velvet that made the face look trebly powdered, masks of the heads of birds, of apes, of serpents, of dolphins, of men and women, of little embryons, and of cats. Masks like the faces of gods, masks of coloured glass, and masks of thin talc and of India rubber. There were wigs of black and scarlet wools, of peacock's feathers, of gold and silver threads, of swan's down, of the tendrils of the vine, of owls, sleeves cut into the shapes of apocryphal animals, drawers flounced down to the ankles and flecked with tiny red roses, stockings clocked with fete gallant, and curious designs, and petticoats cut like artificial flowers. Some of the women had put on delightful little moustaches dyed in purples and bright greens, twisted and waxed with absolute skill, and some wore great white beards after the manner of Saint Wilgeforte. Then Durat had painted extraordinary grotesques and vignettes over their bodies here and there. Upon a cheek an old man scratching his horned head, upon a forehead an old woman teased by an impudent armour, upon a shoulder an amorous singerie, round a breast a circlet of satyrs, about a wrist a wreath of pale unconscious babes, upon an elbow a bouquet of spring flowers, across a back some surprising scenes of adventure, at the corners of a mouth tiny red spots, and upon a neck a flight of birds, a caged parrot, a branch of fruit, a butterfly, a spider, a drunken dwarf, or simply some initials. The supper provided by the ingenious Rambouillet was quite beyond parallel. Never had he created a more exquisite menu. The consommé impromptu alone would have been sufficient to establish the immortal reputation of any chef. What then can I say of the dorade bouillie sauce maréchal, the ragoût au lag de carpe, the rameau à la charnier, the ciboulette de gibier à la espagnole, the pâté de Suisse d'oie au pois de Montsalvi, the queue d'agneau au clair de lune, the artichon à la grecque, the charlotte de pomme à la Lucy Waters, the baumes à la Marais, and the glace aux rayons d'or. A veritable tour de cuisine that surpassed even the famous little suppers given by the Marquise de Rachal at Passy, and which the Abbé Mirleton pronounced impeccable and too good to be eaten. Ah, Pierre Antoine Berquin de Rambouillet, you are worthy of your divine mistress. Mere hunger quickly gave place to those finer instincts of pure gourmet, and the strange wines cooled in buckets of snow unloosed all the décolleté spirits of astonishing conversation and atrocious laughter. As the courses advanced, the conversation grew bustling and more personal. Poulex and Cyril, and Mariska and Kathleen opened a fire of raillery, and 1,000 amatory follies of the day were discussed. From harsh and shrill and clamant, the voices grew blurred and inarticulate. Bad sentences were helped out by worse gestures, and at one table Scabius expressed himself like the famous old knight in the first part of the Soldier's Fortune of Otway. Basilissa and Lestrada tried to pronounce each other's names, and became very affectionate in the attempt, and Tala, the tragedian, robed in roomy purple, and wearing plume and buskin, rose to his feet, and with swaying gestures began to recite one of his favourite parts. He got no further than the first line, but repeated it again and again, with fresh accents and intonations each time, and was only silenced by the approach of the asparagus that was being served by the satyrs dressed in white. Chapter 4. It was always delightful to wake up in a new bedroom. The fresh wallpaper, the strange pictures, the positions of doors and windows, imperfectly grasped the night before, are revealed with all the charm of surprise when we open our eyes the next morning. It was about 8 o'clock when friend Ferluccio woke, stretched himself deliciously in his great plumed 4-post bed, murmured what a pretty room, and freshened the frilled silk pillows behind him. Through the slim parting of the long flowered window curtains, he caught a peep of the sunlit lawns outside, the silver fountains, the bright flowers, the gardeners at work, and beneath the shady trees some early breakfasters, dressed for a day's hunting in the distant wooded valleys. "How sweet it all is!" exclaimed Abbé, yawning with infinite content. Then he lay back in his bed, stared at the curious patterned canopy above him, and nursed his waking thoughts. He thought of the Romaunt de la Rose, beautiful but all too brief, of the Claude in the Lady Delaware's collection, of a wonderful pair of blonde trousers he would get Madame Belleville to make for him, of a mysterious park full of faint echoes and romantic sounds, of a great stagnant lake that must have held the subtlest frogs that ever were, and was surrounded with dark, unreflected trees and sleeping fleur-de-luce. Of St. Rose, the well-known Peruvian virgin, how she vowed herself to perpetual virginity when she was 4 years old, how she was beloved by Mary, who from the pale fresco in the church of St. Dominic would stretch out her arms to embrace her, how she built a little oratory at the end of the garden, and prayed and sang hymns in it till all the beetles, spiders, snails, and creeping things came round to listen. How she promised to marry Ferdinand de Flores, and on the bridal morning perfumed herself and painted her lips, and put on her wedding frock, and decked her hair with roses, and went up to a little hill not far without the walls of Lima, how she knelt there some moments, calling tenderly upon Our Lady's name, and how Saint Mary descended and kissed Rose upon the forehead, and carried her up swiftly into heaven. He thought of the splendid opening of Racine's Britannicus, of a strange pamphlet he had found in Helen's library called A Plea for the Domestication of the Unicorn, of the Bacchanals of Sporian, of Moralis's Madonnas with their high egg-shaped creamy foreheads and well-crimped silken hair, of Rossini's Stabat Mater, that delightfully demandé piece of decadence, with a quality in its music like the bloom upon wax fruit, of love, and of 100 other things. Then his half-closed eyes wandered about the prints that hung upon the rose-striped walls. Within the delicate curved frames lived the corrupt and gracious creatures of Dorrit and his school, slender children in mask and domino smiling horribly, exquisite lechers leaning over the shoulders of smooth, doll-like girls and doing nothing in particular, terrible little Perots posing as lady lovers and pointing at something outside the picture, and unearthly fops and huge bird-like women mingling in some rococo room, lighted mysteriously by the flicker of a dying fire that throws great shadows upon the wall and ceiling. Van Verlooch had taken some books to bed with him. One was witty, extravagant, Tuesday and Josephine. Another was the score of the Rheingold. Making a pulpit of his knees, he propped up the opera before him and turned over the pages with a loving hand, and found it delicious to attack Wagner's brilliant comedy with the cool head of the morning. Once more he was ravished with the beauty and wit of the opening scene, the mystery of its prelude that seems to come upon the very mud of the Rhine, and to be as ancient, the abominable primitive wantonness of the music that follows the talk and movements of the Rhine maidens, the black hateful sounds of Alberic's love-making, and the flowing melody of the river of legends. But it was the third tableau that he applauded most that morning, the scene where Logi, like some flamboyant primeval Scapin, practices his cunning upon Alberic. The feverish, insistent ringing of the hammers at the forge, the dry staccato restlessness of mime, the ceaseless coming and going of the troop of Nibelungs, drawn hither and thither like a flock of terror-stricken and infernal sheep, Alberic's savage activity and metamorphoses, and Loge's rapid, flaming, tongue-like movements, made the tableau the least reposeful, most troubled and confusing thing in the whole range of opera. How the Abbé rejoiced in the extravagant monstrous poetry, the heated melodrama, and splendid agitation of it all. At 11 o'clock, Friend Verlooch got up and slipped off his dainty nightdress. His bathroom was the largest and perhaps the most beautiful apartment in his splendid suite. The well-known engraving by Lorette that forms the frontispiece de Millevoye's architecture du 18 Cécile will bring you a better idea than any words of mine of the construction and decoration of the room. Only in Lorette's engraving the bath sunk into the middle of the floor is a little too small. Friend Verlooch stood for a moment like Narcissus gazing at his reflection in the still scented water, and then, just ruffling its smooth surface with one foot, stepped elegantly into the cool basin, and swam round it twice very gracefully. However, it is not so much at the very bath itself as in the drying and delicious frictions that a bather finds his chiefest joys. And Helen had appointed her most tried attendants to wait upon Friend Verlooch. He was more than satisfied with their attention, that aroused feelings within him almost amounting to gratitude, and when the rites were ended, any touch of homesickness he might have felt was utterly dispelled. After he had rested a little and sipped his chocolate, he wandered into the dressing-room, where, under the direction of the superb Dancourt, his toilet was completed. As pleased as Lord Foppington with his appearance, the Abbé tripped off to bid good morning to Helen. He found her in a sweet white muslin frock, wandering upon the lawn and plucking flowers to deck her breakfast table. He kissed her lightly upon the neck. "I'm just going to feed Adolphe," she said, pointing to a little reticule of buns that hung from her arm. Adolphe was her pet unicorn. "He is such a dear," she continued, "milk white all over, excepting his nose, mouth, and nostrils. This way." The unicorn had a very pretty palace of its own, made of green foliage and golden bars, a fitting home for such a delicate and dainty beast. Ah, it was a splendid thing to watch the white creature roaming in its artful cage, proud and beautiful, knowing no mate, and coming to no hand except the queen's itself. As Fanfreluche and Helen approached, Adolphe began prancing and curveting, pawing the soft turf with his ivory hoofs, and flaunting his tail like a gonfalon. Helen raised the latch and entered. "You mustn't come in with me, Adolphe is so jealous," she said, turning to the Abbé, who was following her. "But you can stand outside and look on. Adolphe likes an audience." Then in her delicious fingers she broke the spicy buns, and with affectionate niceness breakfasted her snowy pet. When the last crumbs had been scattered, Helen brushed her hands together and pretended to leave the cage, without taking any further notice of Adolphe. Adolphe snored. End of Under the Hill by Aubrey Beardsley.